This podcast is brought to you by Oxfam South Africa. Oxfam South Africa is working to fight inequality. Together with our community partners, we are challenging local and national governments to be more accountable and transparent. We are encouraging communities to say no to mining and development on their land without their consent. We are calling on international financial institutions to be more accountable and transparent, and we are responding to disasters and climate change by building local resilience. In this podcast, our guests address the accountability and transparency of the New Development Bank, a BRICS-led initiative to mobilize resources for infrastructure and sustainable development projects. In South Africa, the New Development Bank has approved 11 projects at the value of $5.2 billion. Our discussion focuses on Eskom's Medupi coal-fired power station project valued at $480 million to reduce environmental pollution. We also discuss 2 additional New Development Bank loans with a combined value of 2 billion rand to the South African government for the COVID emergency response and recovery.
Hi, my name is Marianne Buenaventura Goldman. I'm the Global Impact Manager based at Oxfam South Africa. I'm also the co-chair of the Civil Society Forum for the New Development Bank.
Hi, I'm Magali Masamba. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Human Rights, as well as the member of the Civil Society Forum on the New Development Bank. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lebang Kgosana, and I am the head of program at the Center for Environmental Rights for the program Corporate Accountability and Transparency. And welcome to this podcast.
Hi, my name is Danny Bradlow. I'm the Saatchi Professor for International Development Law and African Economic Relations in the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. Welcome to this Oxfam podcast on transparency and accountability of the New Development Bank. I'm here with Lebang Kgosana from the Center for Environmental Rights, Marianne Buenaventura Goldman from Oxfam South Africa, and my colleague from the Center for Human Rights, Dr. Magali Masamba. We're here to discuss the New Development Bank and 2 reports that we've done on the work on the accountability and transparency of that. To begin, and just to put that in context, the New Development Bank is, as its name suggests, meant to be a new type of multilateral development bank that provides financing for developing projects in South Africa. The New Development Bank is created by the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It was meant to be a response to the work of multilateral development banks like the World Bank and the African Development Bank, which have been playing a role in South Africa for many years. Just to put that in context, multilateral development banks are banks to which both rich countries and developing countries belong, and which provide financing for a range of development projects in countries like South Africa. But there are problems with those banks because they're controlled, in the case of the World Bank, by the United States. The African Development Bank is a more Africa-controlled bank, but it tends to follow, in many ways, the policies and practices of the World Bank, and so in some ways is as controversial as the World Bank. The New Development Bank was an attempt by the BRICS countries to say we can do things in a more innovative, more responsible way than the World Bank and the African Development Bank. And we wanted to look and see, are they being more transparent, more accountable, more responsive to the needs of the people of South Africa than these other banks? So with that as introduction, let me ask Magali, as the primary author of these reports, if you want to talk a little bit about what you found, and then I'll go to Marianne to talk about the situation on the ground because she's been visiting them, and then we'll come to Leanne to respond to that. And then we'll have a general discussion about the work of these banks. So Magali, over to you.
Thank you, Danny. So we, together with Oxfam South Africa, worked on 2 reports as part of the Transparency and Accountability series. So the first report is titled Enhancing the New Development Bank's Practice of Information Disclosure, a Civil Society Perspective. And the second, Why the Need for an Independent Accountability Mechanism at the New Development Bank, both of which are available online. So in these 2 reports, we're basically looking at how project-affected communities in South Africa, well, the projects that are funded by the New Development Bank, how these communities are better able to protect themselves from the negative impacts of projects. And so in the first report, we're looking at whether communities have sufficient access to information, whether they know who are the funders of the projects. And we looked at how the New Development Bank deals with access to information. And we actually tested the information disclosure policy and platform on the New Development Bank's website. In the second report, we were looking at how can communities actually voice their concerns where projects are having negative impacts and where there might be challenges with the implementation of the bank's policies. And here specifically, we were looking at whether the bank has an independent accountability mechanism, which it doesn't. And just to explain a little bit, an IAM, or an independent accountability mechanism, is really a platform that communities can use to raise their concerns on the implementations of policies of a bank, or even the negative impact of projects. And we were looking at why the need for an IAM at the New Development Bank, and provided best practice or recommendations from the experience of other multilateral banks that have independent accountability mechanisms.
Great. No, thank you. That gives some good background. So, Marianne, can you talk about what happened on the ground? Did people manage to get a better response from the New Development Bank? And I know you were just come back from Lephalale, where Medupi is located. Were people there able to access and communicate with the New Development Bank? And also, do you think they were able to have a better relationship or better interactions with them than in the case of the World Bank or the African Development Bank?
Thanks very much for the questions, Danny. So sadly, I wish I could provide much more positive response, but sadly, the case is no to all of those questions. The communities do not know who the New Development Bank. And the specific community that I visited in Lephalale, they are living in the shadow of one of the largest coal power stations in the world. It's the largest polluter of sulfur dioxide, I understand, of late in the media reports, and are suffering extremely negative consequences of the emissions. We're happy when we have the lights on, right? When businesses have, electricity and can operate business as usual, when we can go home and turn the lights on and cook for our children and do homework. But if you were to visit this community and see the level of suffering, right, it is horrendous in terms of the very negative health impacts. So no, they don't know who the New Development Bank, but it's not only the New Development Bank that we should be addressing when it comes to the Medupi coal power-fired station. And the role of the NDB is also where they've been operating so far in South Africa. In many ways, their view is not to replace or substitute funding by the bigger banks and the older banks like the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Banks, and so forth, but to complement, right? So it's actually asking communities, do they know who the financiers, it's not just about looking at Eskom and what Eskom is doing, but it's also to hold accountable these other development financial institutions. And so sadly, no, they don't know very much about the New Development Bank, and, understanding the role of what makes the difference between a development bank, a multilateral development bank, and an ordinary private bank, the ones that we know here, the ABSAs, the Nedbank, the Investex, right? But they do have a duty, a responsibility to ensure consultation with communities of the projects that they support, to promote environmental and social safeguards, including looking at the situation of women and upholding what we call the sustainable development goals when it comes to gender equality. All of these banks are meant to espouse these grandiose principles. But it's so sad to see what you actually, how people are affected, especially women. And that's actually one of the things that we've been trying to push. It all starts with when it comes to looking at the situation of women, banks must have a plan to address how women may be affected in their projects from the very start of a project. But let me leave it at that.
So, Leanne, I know you've been doing a lot of work trying to get information from the New Development Bank and from the South African government about what the New Development Bank is doing and what its policies are and practices are, particularly around Medupi. What's your experience? Have you been able to get information from the bank or from the government? And do you think that the problem is with the bank or with the government?
Thank you, Danny. Incredibly interesting questions, given what Marianne has said around the experiences of communities and other civil society organizations in trying to access information about the projects funded by the NDB. I think at the first instance, it's important to remember that the NDB, if they are funding a project in a particular country, they often refer information requests back to their clients. So, for example, if they have provided financing, which they have done in the case of Medupi in the amount of about 480 million USD for the installation of particular technology at Medupi to improve air quality in that local area, where they have done financing or financed that particular project, they would refer you back to Eskom as their client in order to access information. And that can be problematic and is problematic for a number of reasons. The first is that very process that I've outlined, the fact that you must go to the client of the NDB in order to access information, is not very clear from their existing policies. So first, the process of accessing information and different types of information is not clear. And second, it's not clear that the clients of the NDB recognize that they have this responsibility. Even where we have gone to Eskom to say what is going on in relation to this particular loan, because Eskom on its own admission hasn't installed this technology at Medupi, there's a lack of clarity and you're not likely to get an answer from the client. In the second instance, there are issues around the types of information that you can request. And at this point, it appears that while you can request information about particular policies that relate to the NDB, actual project-related information, actual issues related to due diligence reports, for example, that the NDB would have in their possession is not something that is set out in the process for accessing information. So I think to answer your question quite succinctly, our experience has not been a positive one. Processes are unclear, and it is unclear what types of information can be requested when. And finally, I think there is a major issue around communicating with those directly impacted by projects. Because on the ground, if a community member is saying to Marianne, look, we're not sure what's going on, immediately that's a problem. Information needs to be available to communities in local languages, and you'd rather do more than do less in terms of ensuring that communities have access to information or information on where do they go to access that information.
I mean, I also think if banks have policies on environmental and social issues, and they all claim that they do, and they do have them, then they representing to themselves and their staff and to the world that they will live up to those policies in the work that they do. And they should be responsible and held accountable if they don't live up to those policies, regardless of what Eskom, the client, does. Eskom has its own responsibilities, and it shouldn't be able to avoid that responsibility by putting the blame on the banks and saying, get the report from the bank or from the government, or we haven't done it. If they didn't do what they were supposed to, they should be held accountable for that. But that doesn't relieve the banks of their own responsibility. I mean, and that's, in a sense, the importance of having an accountability mechanism, because the people who know they haven't done what they should are usually the people on the ground who were expecting to have a project that would benefit their society or their community, and it hasn't happened. And they're entitled to say, well, what went wrong? Why didn't we get what we were supposed to? I mean, one of the things about this, which always makes these projects so complicated, is that the government is involved, and that, which means the state is involved. And the Development Bank is always nervous of stepping on the sovereignty of the state and somehow undermining the state's position. I mean, it seems in a way that the state has to be proactive. It can't just sit back and not do anything. But it also suggests that civil society maybe has a role in trying to push the state or in making sure that the state does its job of looking after the project and making sure it delivers as it should. So, Marian, I was wondering, do you have any ideas on how the South African government could become a more proactive, more responsible government, in a sense, in dealing with these projects? Because, I mean, it's clear from what you've said and what we know from other cases that the communities in Lephalale, for example, are not getting, I mean, they're not even getting the electricity while they sit there looking at the biggest power plants, one of the biggest power plants in the world. They get nothing. Is there anything we can do, or the government can do, to improve the situation?
Well, I think the first part, or let's call it the start, is figuring out how best that civil society can have an open dialogue with government, in this instance, National Treasury, because it is the lead government department in terms of its role in the new development bank. South Africa is an equal member state of the NDB, along with the other BRICS countries, with a small, very small percentage to some new members that have joined in 2021, being within Africa, it is Egypt. Other countries include Bangladesh, the United Arab Emirates, and Uruguay. And I think it's very important, given the ambition that the NDB has in terms of expanding its membership, to get things right in its own country, right, in our country. And so what we have been promoting and sending letters about, writing an op-ed piece, asking the finance minister, including the last budget speech last February, is a civil society engagement platform directly with Treasury. And I think it's about also having a constructive dialogue, so that at the end of the day, that people in the locations of the projects do have a say in what happens and how they are affected by these projects, how they can improve the design, and civil society can assist in terms of playing that role of bridge to the communities. Because I think that if projects continue to be funded by these development banks, including the Bretton Woods institutions, in such a way, we will continue to have the same kinds of problems that we see as a result of these large or mega projects, infrastructure projects, where you see very negative development outcomes. And that's not what is meant to be in terms of when you design a project by the NDB or any of the other development banks.
So, Leanne, I know the Centre for Environmental Rights does a lot of litigation, including against the South African government and including around access to information issues. Have you been doing, or do you think there is work you should be doing around, or could be doing, not should be doing, but could be doing around trying to get the South African government to push the NDB to be more transparent, at least in South Africa, if not as a bank as a whole?
Thanks, Danny. It's difficult to answer that question, given that the South African government in itself often does not comply with its own information kind of regulations. And so to engage with the South African government around, or even particular clients of the NDB, who would include Eskom, Transnet, etc., around saying, look, we want increased compliance and we want there to be improved access to information, where the government itself isn't abiding by its own regulations and pieces of legislation, can be difficult. I think that ultimately you have to take an approach that challenges both those institutions. So whether it's the client or it's the NDB, you have to be able to challenge both. What we are doing is we are writing to the NDB directly in relation to the Medupi project, at the very least, to raise some of these issues around the use of the finance. And what will also be important in relation to that is that we as civil society recognize the importance of doing this kind of work. So raising the profile around what the role of the bank is in financing major infrastructure projects that really could determine, the the good or the bad development of Southern Africa and Africa in general. And so we need to be able to be alive to that fact and ensure that we place the necessary pressure on the bank. I'm not sure that a strategy of addressing the government directly in relation to their non-compliance would be very effective.
So Magali, one of the things about South Africa and the bank was that South Africa negotiated and the New Development Bank set up its first regional office in South Africa, the African Regional Center. The theory was it would bring the bank closer to the client and it would be a more responsive bank. I know you've been doing research on this. What has been the experience with the African Regional Office?
Thank you so much for that question. Indeed, the NDB has established the ARC, the African Regional Center, that is based in Johannesburg. I guess when this center was established, there was a hope that it would play such an important role, I guess, to represent, African interests at the NDB, that it would play a leading role when it comes to, for example, project identification, project development, preparation, and so forth. But based on the research that we've been doing at the Center for Human Rights, as well as, the work we've been doing with Oxfam, as well as our interactions with the ARC, it seems that the ARC is really, maybe I can just liken it to like an operational branch that doesn't have a very big decision-making role or a say-so, or can adequately represent, for example, South African and possibly now I can also say Egyptian interests within the bank. It's an administrative office, at least from how it functions. That's probably what I can say on the ARC. There isn't much to say because I don't think they've been very active when it comes to the project space in South Africa and Lesotho.
I mean, one question for all of you really is, because in addition to being a project lender, the NDB has also given South Africa, if I remember correctly, $2 billion in loans connected with COVID, which was, is a significant amount of money and was an important contribution to the government's ability to deal with the pandemic. Because listening to you, one could think that the best answer is to say, don't borrow from the bank. It's just a bad news. But on the other hand, if it's getting $2 billion in the time of crisis, that suggests these banks do have an important role to play in the country at moments of need. And so I was wondering what your thoughts were and if you had done any more work on, do we know how that $2 billion was spent? How the government's accounting for that?
I'll take that question, Danny. So thanks. It's actually an area that we are researching right now. We did try to go through the NDB information disclosure platform to request the information about one of the two COVID loans, the emergency response loan. And unfortunately, we weren't able to access that information, despite the fact when it comes to project information, according to the NDB's Environmental and Social Framework, Section 23, they are meant to include or make available social and environmental documents in a timely manner, in an accessible place. Leanne mentioned the challenge of language, right? And in a form and language understandable to affected people and to other stakeholders, including the general public. And why? And the reason is that so that they, let's say, affected communities can be involved in terms of its project design and implementation. So for so many years, the NDB has now been operational for 7 years. That information is still not accessible, whether we try and look on the website where they're meant to include this information, or if we request it according to their information disclosure policy. So the policy and the practice has been a real challenge. So what we actually had done is we had gone through the PIA process, and we were able to access some information in relation to the COVID loan.
PIA is the
Promotion for the Access to Information Act.
So it's the way you get information from the South African government.
Yeah, and we just didn't know any alternative way. We tried to go according to the guidelines of the NDB, But given their inability to share information with the public, with civil society organizations, we went that route. When it comes to the COVID loans, I agree that those funds were very much needed in terms of a response. But again, the challenge is that we don't know how those funds have been spent. And we've heard a lot of stories in the media, right, in terms of the misuse of government funding, right? And those funds were actually contributed to as budget support. So even tracing that information. So there are a lot of questions. And I guess that was an unusual situation that, in terms of responding to an emergency, I don't think that had been initially a role that had been anticipated that the NDB would play beforehand.
So the situation seems not very happy with the NDB in terms of access to information and accountability. But maybe before being too critical, we should compare it to other development banks and see, is their performance as good as, worse than, or equal to other development banks? So I was wondering if any of you have had experience dealing with any of the other development banks like the World Bank or the African Development Bank, and whether you think the NDB is, how it compares to that.
Maybe I can take this question, Danny. We have had experience in dealing with a few other MDBs and even local DFIs in South Africa or development finance institutions in South Africa. And on the whole, it is quite difficult to get information from even the World Bank or the African Development Bank related to the ways in which finance has been used. So, just looking at the example that Marianne raised, how were the funds spent ultimately by the beneficiary of those funds or the clients? That information is very difficult to find. And the surprising part about this is that all these banks have an obligation to ensure that there's ongoing due diligence in relation to their projects and that there are monitoring reports that are produced. Oftentimes, these monitoring reports would be provided to the boards of these various development banks. So it's not like that information is not being produced. It's just not being made available. And I think what's important around, if we just go back to a second around the Medupi loan, that loan was made in 2019. The NDB made that loan in 2019. But the African Development Bank and the World Bank has also contributed to the very similar financing to Eskom in order for this technology to be installed. And in relation to both of those banks, we also don't have information on kind of how those funds were spent and why there isn't installation of that technology to date. So I think this is overall been an experience we've had with most banks. But I think it is surprising that this occurs in relation to the NDB because at the time at which they were formed, quite a time after some of these, these other banks, they'd made a clear commitment to being a different kind of bank, being the BRICS bank, being a bank that would support development in the global south primarily. You would just expect a different kind of approach from them.
And if I may add on to what Leanne has just mentioned, on the component of accountability, I think the NDB is lagging behind other development banks like, the World Bank and the African Development Bank. If you look at the general approach, or at least what best practice is telling us that MDBs do need to, or multilateral development banks do need to have some form of a platform where these institutions can be held accountable to their own policies. In fact, all the major multilateral development banks have independent accountability mechanisms, with the World Bank being, I guess, the first institution to establish one. So the NDB, which is the newest multilateral development bank, has had, I guess, decades of learning from the experience of other multilateral development banks, but seemingly there hasn't been enough progress made on the establishment of an IAM. We were informed at the launch of the reports that the MDB soon will be, I guess, launching the IAM, which is problematic because there hasn't been anything I guess there hasn't been any public consultations in this process. We're not sure what their IAM looks like. There isn't any engagement with civil society organizations or the public. So the users of this supposed platform are not part of the process of actually designing and contributing to what that platform looks like.
So, I mean, I think we're coming towards the end. I suppose one question just to think about this is, do you think private commercial banks are actually better than the NDB in terms of its transparency and accountability? Or is it, because yes, I think that's a question for Leanne, because I know your organization has definitely been involved in litigation with commercial banks as well.
Yes, thanks, Danny, for coming up with very hard questions. I mean, I would say that, firstly, it's difficult to compare the two just because of their mandate. Private banks are accountable to their shareholders in the first instance, and their main objective is profit-making. An MDB, and the New Development Bank in particular, is responsible for sustainable development and contributing to sustainable development in the global south. So it's difficult to compare the two private and kind of multilateral development banks because of their very, very different mandates. I would say that with private commercial banks, because they are very, very concerned about reputational harm, they are generally more responsive and more nimble in how they react to criticism by civil society. And so, where Standard Bank, for example, has been and continues to be criticized over the East African oil pipeline, right? Of course, they still haven't indicated that they won't finance a project, but they certainly have tried to engage around the issue. Many commercial banks will try to engage on the issue without necessarily moving on a commitment to not financing new gas or not financing new coal, which is not great, but they would engage a little bit more and try, through various shareholder activism platforms, engagement at AGMs, etc., to try. Whereas I think our experience with the MDBs is that they can be such large, kind of immovable institutions that it's difficult even to start at that point of engagement to try and understand their reasoning, which I think is problematic. I do want to say, make a slightly different point just about mandates. And that is in relation to how an MDB needs to consider its role as part of a broader group of banks, development institutions that are responsible for addressing our climate crisis. And I think that they have a very particular role to play, but I'm led by you in terms of whether I can elaborate on that point.
Yes, because I think the climate issue is such an important issue that, and because South Africa is getting money from governments, it's good to include some of that in here. So for maybe a minute or two, that would be great.
Okay, thanks, Danny. South Africa has what we call a climate finance deal underway. We often think of it as being a single deal, but actually we have a commitment from, let's call them northern countries, to finance our just energy transition in the amount of 8.5 billion. But in fact, over the next 3 decades, South Africa is going to need about 250 billion USD to finance a just transition in this country. So to move us away from coal and to support those communities that would be affected by that move. And so in the mobilization of capital for our broader climate finance goals and to support the just transition, there is an immense role that MDBs can play that private commercial banks, I think, cannot play because they are so profit-driven. MDBs have a mandate to ensure development. And in fact, on the African continent, they have an immense opportunity to avoid any new gas build-out. So they can support us leapfrogging over gas into a renewable energy sector that takes Africa into a whole new space of really sustainable development for both people and the planet, right? And so, at least in relation to the New Development Bank, in their new strategy, which covers 2022 to 2026, they're saying they're going to have a spend down of about 30 billion USD. About 40% of that will be spent on climate resilient projects. And then they make this reference to clean energy projects. Really needs to be noted that there's a big difference between clean energy and renewable energy. Clean energy could very well include new gas projects. Clean energy could also include technology that would create what is known as clean coal, which we know is a myth, right? And so with the NDB having made that commitment to spend 40% of this 30 billion on climate resilient projects, there's a huge question around what will they spend that money on and how will they contribute to South Africa's realization of a just energy and a just transition over the next 3 decades. And I think if we as civil society are to do our jobs right, we need to keep a very careful eye on that finance and continue to push for a completely just transition that addresses not just workers, but all the unintended consequences of us decommissioning our coal plants as it relates to the informal economy, as it relates to communities who rely on the coal economy in a number of ways. So I just want to really highlight that and say that there's immense opportunity here if MDBs can get it right and live up to their mandate.
I think one of the lessons to take out of this is that the just transition, the role of the development banks is an issue that's really, we don't know. We know we need them. We know they're not perfect. Nobody's perfect. But we need mechanisms for making sure that the engagement is as inclusive and as accountable as possible. And that's not just a question of the bank. We need the bank to have a proper accountability mechanism, but we also need the government to be more open and transparent and more inclusive in its planning of how it will use all these sources to promote a just transition. If we're going to spend $250 billion over time to get to a better place in terms of environmental and social issues, we need everybody involved in the process. And that includes civil society working with government and with these banks.
Visit www.oxfam.org.za to read the 2 papers on accountability and transparency of the new development bank. Join the conversation on our social media platforms, Oxfam SA on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.